That's my understanding. So this is going to be recorded, so you'll be able to access the full presentation later. So as you know, today we're going to be speaking about our role as psychotherapists in supporting trans and non-binary clients during these increasingly hostile socio-political climates. The art I included here is a piece called A Year of War by Hungarian artist Sabina Farkas-B. Now, the artist described this work as their reaction to the war in neighboring Ukraine, saying that it contained both their fear and their sense of solidarity with the people directly affected. This concept of sitting at the intersection of fear and solidarity really spoke to me when I thought about my work right now, and when I thought about those of you who I imagined are in our audience today. Before we begin, we want to situate ourselves a bit. So I'll introduce myself and then pass it over to Dr. Matsuno for their introduction and to get us started. I'm Sebastian Barr. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a counseling psychologist. I'm coming to you from Western Massachusetts. I'm a trans man, and I work as both a therapist and as a researcher. The majority of my clients are trans, and my research primarily focuses on trans and non-binary people's traumatic stress. As a white trans man in Western Massachusetts, I am largely protected from the direct impacts of the current climate, as are many of my Massachusetts-based clients, though the indirect impacts continue to be profound. And I'm not from here, so like many, I am closely connected to friends and family in more hostile areas. Additionally, I work in multiple areas of the country, including Kansas, where I'm also licensed and have clients, and I'm closely involved with the PFLAG Charlotte organization and supporting parents and families of trans and LGBTQ people in North Carolina.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So my name's M. Matsuno. My pronouns are they, them. I'm an assistant professor of counseling psychology at Arizona State University, which I also wanted to acknowledge resides on the lands of the Kimmel, O'odham, and Peepash peoples. So I bring to this talk today my research expertise, which is on trans and non-binary minority stress and resilience. And I also want to acknowledge that, I'm not currently a practicing clinician, but I do have a lot of specialized training working with trans non-binary clients. I'm also currently working on revising the APA guidelines for clinical practice with trans and gender diverse clients. As with Sebastian, I bring my own lived experience to this talk as a non-binary trans queer person of color who's really involved in trans communities and also been involved in advocacy efforts within Arizona. So we wanted to give a little overview and agenda of what we're going to be discussing today. So first, I'm going to be providing an overview of the current political climate and also the impacts that this is having. So a lot of the content that I'm going to be covering, might be upsetting and triggering. And so I just want everybody to be aware of that, be able to take care of yourselves as you need, especially for trans and non-binary folks. I know many of us are well aware of the attacks that we are facing right now. So it's totally okay if you wanted to skip that first half and come back. In the second half, Dr. Barr is going to be talking about clinical approaches and supporting trans clients during this time. And then at the end, we're going to have a few minutes to just briefly discuss advocacy. I think as was mentioned, we hope to have a few minutes at the end for Q&A, although we're trying to pack a lot into this 1-hour presentation. But if you do have questions as we're going along, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. And Dr. Barr and I are also willing to share our slides with everybody who registered. And we also created a resource handout that we will share with everybody at the end of the webinar. Okay, so first to just get in what's happening with the current political climate. So this is the 4th year in a row that we see breaking numbers of anti-LGBTQ legislation, with the vast majority targeting trans people and trans youth specifically. These attacks in 2023, we're really seeing an escalation in these attacks. A lot of these bills are cruel, aggressive, dehumanizing, relentless, and spreading quickly. To refer back to the title of our talk, it really feels like everyone is coming for us and from all sides. And so to just situate us in the current political moment, I wanted to talk a little bit about what's happening in 2023 and how that's different from years past. So the first difference, if we go to the next slide, is the sheer number of bills that we're seeing, and also the speed in which these bills are moving through legislation. So this year, 2023, we've already seen over 500 bills introduced across 49 different states. This is already 3 times as many bills as were introduced in 2022. So this is just so exponential, the growth you can see from this graphic right here. Another key difference for this year is that the legislation is not only being introduced, but many of these bills are being passed. This is a #1 priority for a lot of legislators. Right off the bat in January, legislators are introducing, several bills. For example, in Oklahoma, right in January, over 20 bills that are attempting to ban gender-affirming healthcare for minors were already introduced. If you can click through a couple more. Great. Yeah. So I wanted to also really highlight the spike in the number of healthcare bills that we're seeing, which is really, really concerning. So just for a little bit of context, prior to 2023, there were only 2 states that had passed categorical bans on gender-affirming care for minors: Arkansas in 2021 and Alabama in 2022. Both of those bans have been blocked in court, and so none of those have gone into effect. And yet in 2023, we have over 30 states introducing healthcare bans. And by the end of this month, we're looking at 15 to 20 states that will have passed legislation to ban gender-affirming care for minors. We are approaching almost half the country in the matter of a few months. So this is a very scary and significant difference of what's happening this year. Okay, so the next slide. In addition to the number of bills, the speed the bills are going through legislation is also the breadth of the bills. So we're seeing all different types of legislation in 2023. As a little bit of historical context, in 2015, same-sex marriage was legalized. And then after that, we see the efforts shift towards focusing on attacks towards trans people. So in 2016, this is when we see the wave of bathroom bills happening. Then after that, 2017, 2018, things peter out at the state legislative level, and then we see things pick back up again. So in 2020, Idaho became the first state to pass a ban on trans girls participating in sports. 2021, 2022, we see a big uptick in anti-trans legislation, but they're primarily focused on these 2 areas: banning trans girls from participating in sports and banning gender-affirming healthcare for minors. And now in 2023, the sports bans, the healthcare bans, they're still moving forward with full force, but now we're seeing all kinds of other legislations happening again. The bathroom bills are back. All of a sudden they're back. They're passing with even more extreme measures. For the very first time in 2023, we're seeing bans on drag performances in public places where minors could be present. We're also seeing curriculum bans. So, a lot of this started in 2022 with Florida's passing the Don't Say Gay or Trans bill, but now we're seeing these curriculum bills spreading to several other states across the country. Another couple of really alarming types of legislation that we're seeing is forced outing bills and forced misgendering bills. So what this means is that teachers at schools or staff, they would be required to let parents know if a student came out as trans or started using a different name or pronouns than associated with their sex assigned at birth. Or there are other types of bills that would literally force teachers to misgender students, use pronouns that are associated with their sex assigned at birth, unless they had written parental permission. So trans people are misgendered all the time already, but now we're enforcing that for trans students in schools. So just the number and different types of attacks is another reason that 2023 has been really overwhelming. Okay, so in addition to the number of types of bills, we're also seeing much more extreme bills. So, a lot of politicians are not even really trying to hide what they're doing. This has never been about protecting women. It's never been about protecting children. It's been about eradicating trans people from existing in public spaces. On March 4th, there was the Conservative Political Action Conference, and Speaker Michael Knowles famously quoted that transgenderism must be eradicated from public life, afterwards receiving a large eruption of applause. So in terms of just some of the more extreme things that we're seeing, number one is categorical bans on gender affirming care for minors. So we're not just seeing a restriction or a limitation in the type of care, all kinds of care, puberty blockers, hormones, surgery, all of that is just being completely banned. These bans would not only be for people who are looking to engage in those services in the future, it would also take away ongoing care from people who are already accessing this care, which is going to have very, very devastating and dangerous consequences. Next, we are also seeing bans for medical care for adults. So it's not just about protecting children. This is about stopping trans people from getting the medical care that they need. At least 3 states have introduced legislation that would ban gender affirming care for adults. For example, in Oklahoma, they proposed a bill that would make it a felony for providers to provide gender affirming care to adults under the age of 26. Other legislators are going outside of legislation and using other, like executive branches are using other means to restrict this type of care. Just as another example, last month in Missouri, the Attorney General issued a quote unquote emergency regulation that in effect would categorically ban gender affirming care for minors and adults, so people of all ages. In the bills that we're seeing, it's not just banning care, it's also criminalizing those who provide the care. So for doctors and physicians who prescribe hormones or puberty blockers, they could be faced with losing their license, heavy legal fines, and potentially a felony charge that would include jail time. The next bullet I have. Okay, so 2022, many of you might be aware that in Texas, Governor Greg Abbott issued instructions to Child Protective Services to investigate families who were supporting their children in accessing medical care. CPS did actually investigate families for child abuse that is happening in Texas. But now what we're seeing in 2023 is now we're seeing actual bills being proposed. So just as an example, in Wyoming, they are trying to change the definition of child abuse to include supporting a child accessing gender affirming medical care. So for parents in Wyoming who are engaging in this type of, allowing their child to engage in this type of care could be charged with child abuse and receive up to 10 years in prison. And then finally, another escalation you might remember in Florida. So many things happening in Florida, but in Florida last year, the Florida Department of Health issued guidance to all medical providers that not only they should stop gender affirming medical care, but that they should also stop and not support social transition for minors. So again, this is not about the medical piece. This is really about stopping trans people from transitioning. And then lastly are these drag bans. So, you know, there is a history in our country of cross-dressing laws. This is not something that's new, but I think it has been very shocking for a lot of people to see that the government is literally interfering with people's ability to dress and express their gender how they want. And another thing about these drag bills is that they're written so broadly that they could actually ban trans people altogether from performing in public. So the way that the laws are written is that you can't be a quote unquote female impersonator or male impersonator, which is defined as dressing as a gender that's different from your sex assigned at birth. And so literally trans person performing in public could be punished under these laws. Next slide. Okay, so in addition to being aware of all these attacks that we're facing, it's also really important to acknowledge and to become aware of the resistance that's happening. So trans people have long been prosecuted, for decades and decades, and we have always resisted. We cannot be erased. And so just some things that are happening, while there's a lot of legislation being proposed, a lot of these bills are failing, they're not passing, or they're being blocked in court, even by, judges that are more conservative. So that's something that we also need to be reminded of. This year, at least a dozen states have introduced protections for people who are engaging with or providing gender-affirming medical care. So there's a lot of states that are kind of signaling that they're sanctuary states and passing these bills, in case there's some kind of federal laws that happen in the future. And then finally, I just want to make note of youth-led activism. Youth are not passive objects that are being debated about. They are resisting, they are fighting back, they are walking out of schools and protesting. They are leading in activism, they are testifying in court. And when I see, so many young people embracing their full authentic selves, that really gives me hope. And there's a lot of momentum and resistance there. And I think that's important to acknowledge and not forget about. Okay, so, all right. So moving along, we wanted to talk about now, what are the impacts of what we see happening in the political climate? And I wanted to start off by sharing some of the personal impacts. Both Dr. Barr and I thought that it would be important to share some of our own personal experiences as trans community members. I believe Dr. Barr is going to share more about his experience in his portion of the presentation, but I'll just share quickly a little bit about my experience. And, first I want to name that I have so many privileges that protect me from a lot of the direct effects of this legislation, being an adult, being somebody who's not currently seeking medical care, being a trans mass person, a light-skinned person, having education, like so many of these things really protect me in a lot of ways. But I did want to share just a little bit about my experience and a little anecdote. So I moved to Arizona from California in 2021, and I definitely felt the shift in the social political climate. It was palpable. And last year in the fall, 2022, was the midterms elections. And if you were paying attention to the news, you might have seen that Arizona had a lot of really contentious races. So driving around, we would see all kinds of political signs. And I remember, driving to lunch one day and passing this sign by U.S. Senate candidate Blake Masters. And so the sign says, Blake Masters won't ask your pronouns in the U.S. Senate. And, while this sign and messaging wasn't surprising to me, it still impacted me. It still hurt. And it makes me feel like I'm being made fun of. It brought up, feelings of insecurity. And I think the other thing is that these messages remind me that there's a lot of people out there that agree with this message, out of all the things that you could put on a political sign, this is what was chosen because it was going to be such a popular message. And that just, makes me feel really sad, really invalidated. And for people living in Arizona or so many other states across the country, I think we get constant reminders, and the political climate is constantly telling us, that there's people who don't understand us, who don't think that we should have rights, that we shouldn't exist at all. And I think those reminders, it does take a toll. And so next I'm going to be talking about some of the practical implications, the material consequences of the legislation. But I think it's important to remember just the political climate and just these messages, it's already having a really damaging effect. So to start off, what are some of the impacts on trans and non-binary people of all ages, but especially youth? We are definitely seeing mental health impacts. In 2022, the Trevor Project found that 86% of youth reported that the anti-trans legislation was negatively impacting their mental health. After Arkansas in 2021 passed a law that would ban gender-affirming care, even though that law did not go into effect, that state already saw a spike in suicidality and the number of calls going to suicide crisis lines. Speaking for myself, like after 2022, I already felt exhausted from fighting all of the anti-trans legislation that's happening in Arizona. In 2023, there's just been so much more. It can be really overwhelming. We can feel burnout and hopeless. It's hard not to feel hopeless at times. And I think now that we're coming up to the reality that these bills are going to be going into effect, that is creating a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety about what we're going to do. So in terms of the healthcare bans, as far as my knowledge, right now, there are no healthcare bans that have gone into effect and are being enforced. There definitely are providers that are stopping care out of fear. And a lot of the bans that have been passed so far, they are scheduled to go in effect starting July 1. So this summer, we definitely are going to be seeing a lot of crises happening. And not only do these bans have mental health effects, but they're also going to be physically dangerous. So just completely cutting people off care, abruptly stopping hormones, that's going to have physical consequences as well. In terms of the sports bans, right now, 21 states have banned trans girls from participating in sports at all levels. And a lot of these bans were passed last year, so they're now going into effect. We're also looking at a pending law at a national level that would ban trans girls from participating in sports. And so, it's interesting because there's actually very few trans girls who are even participating in sports to begin with, but they're being banned, and it's just very cruel to take away these opportunities to have the messages that you don't deserve equal rights and you can't access sports and all the benefits of being on a team and participating in those sports. And then finally, I think overall in our culture, we're seeing an increase in harassment and emboldened violence. Trans communities have always experienced harassment and violence, especially, trans women of color. So that is not new, but we are seeing new types of threats. For example, there have been, white supremacist extremist groups that are showing up to drag performances armed, right, and trying to be that really intense threat. Here in Tempe, there was a drag brunch that had to be canceled due to a bomb threat. So also the impact on families is truly, truly heartbreaking. There are currently thousands of families who are in crisis right now, not knowing what they're going to do, how they're going to help their kid have the medical care that they need. Several families are already moving to different states. So moving from Texas, moving out of Florida to states where they can access healthcare. And that is a huge transition, a huge loss of, leaving your community behind. Some families are actually separating from their children, so they're sending their children to live with grandparents, extended family members who live in states where they can access healthcare. Many families who are not able to move at the current moment, they're trying to seek healthcare in different states, so traveling great distances. But this is also difficult because for puberty blockers or for hormones, it's not just like a one-time thing that you can pop over for a doctor's visit one time and then you're good. It's ongoing care. And so that's another reason that it's making it so hard to figure out how to get this care for the trans youth. Now that we're going to see so many bans, right, almost half the country, what's going to happen is all of these youth are going to begin to seek healthcare in states that do allow gender affirming care. So what we're going to see is this huge increase in the wait list. Now, most gender clinics across the country already have very long wait lists, like 6 months or longer. So this is just going to increase to potentially years. And that's also really problematic because for a lot of this care, like it can't wait. For puberty blockers, you have to block puberty before you go through puberty. And so a lot of kids are going to be forced to go through the wrong puberty or really not receiving that care in that time that they need. As I mentioned, with Governor Abbott in Texas, parents are being investigated by CPS for child abuse. And now there's a lot of fear around their children being taken away, or that they might be facing criminal charges for child abuse just for supporting their child. And then finally, Florida has so many things, but this last week, more anti-trans bills passed. One of them basically provides Florida with like emergency jurisdiction and the ability to take custody away from affirming parents and prioritize custody to unaffirming parents, even for parents who don't live in Florida. And so that's another really scary bill that's currently happening. And finally, I just wanted to briefly mention the impact on providers. Providers of this care are experiencing a lot of increased harassment online. They're experiencing death threats. So far, we've seen some gender clinics shutting down, and then also receiving bomb threats. So for example, Boston Children's Hospital experienced several bomb threats during last year. And so I think almost every clinic across the country has increased security measures due to all these threats of violence. Providers are now being faced with really, really hard ethical decisions about whether they are going to stop practicing care, and potentially be contributing to, all these people losing care. But on the other hand, they may face losing their license. They may face being criminalized or being sentenced to jail. And it's a very stressful impact on providers right now. Okay.
Okay. We're going to switch gears here and talk about the roles and opportunities we have as care providers. First, I just want to thank Dr. Matsuno for taking on what I think is the most challenging part of this talk. I think it's really hard to even sit and hear and be reminded of all of this. And so I just appreciate the work that they put into laying that all out for us. And I'd encourage us all to sort of take a breath and see if we can kind of re-regulate a bit. I'm going to timestamp for us too, also, because again, we got started late. I'm going to be talking for about 20 minutes about some clinical approaches. And then Dr. Matsuno will come in and spend a few minutes at the end talking about advocacy and avoiding burnout. And then we'll stick around a little bit longer for a brief Q&A, I think. But so I do think really up until 1, I'm going to be talking about clinical approaches. And if it wasn't apparent as Dr. Matsuno was talking, this is a crisis. And it's really important that clinicians understand this. And while we'll be talking about some stuff that is specific to or unique even to this particular crisis, you likely have skill sets from other crisis work that can be adapted and brought into this. And I want you to hold on to that. So let's open with some brief clinical exchanges that are similar to encounters I've had multiple times this year. A client open session by rolling through the news items that have happened since we last met. They become increasingly activated as the bills proposed, laws passed, and op-eds published spill out of their mouth and pile up in the room. They ask somewhat rhetorically, do I need to be preparing to leave? Like, what's coming next? Or maybe they don't ask. They say, I made sure my passport didn't need to be renewed and I'm making plans to leave the country if it gets bad enough. Or the client tells you they paid for a service to remove their family's address from online listings. Maybe another client who's working on a college degree told you that they're enrolling in online courses and have stopped going to classes in person because they believe their transness is legible and it's not safe for them to be identifiably trans in mainstream society where they live right now. I think it's really critical to understand that trans and non-binary people expressing these fears or plans or patterns of behavior are not necessarily displaying paranoia or hypervigilance. Fear, mistrust of non-trans people and institutions, and wariness or extra precaution and protection are all potentially adaptive responses to the reality of this current climate. Black psychological scholars and clinicians have termed this adaptive cultural mistrust and have discussed this concept as it applies to Black Americans living in realities where mistrust of white society and white people is actually valid and protective. The take home here is that sentiments and practices that may sound paranoid to some outside of an oppressed community may actually be quite reasonable and are often helpful or even necessary to some degree. So if you hear a client expressing these fears or discussing engaging in protective behavior that feels extreme to you, the first thing I want you to do is pause and quietly check in with yourself and whether your judgment of what is an appropriate or adaptive response is being limited by your own cultural lens or your social positionality and privilege and or your own defense strategies or coping mechanisms. So I might ask myself, am I initially responding to this as though it's over the top because I'm scared and I'm trying to tell myself that things aren't so bad? Is it because in my world, things are different? Is my whiteness coming in here? Is it because I'm in Massachusetts or because of my gender presentation? If I were cisgender, I would definitely be checking in with myself on that. Maybe you aren't hearing this level of alarm in your circles. But to be frank, as Dr. Matsuno laid out, there are trans people and families who will only be able to access legal medical care or have legal protections if they move. And there are cultural and geographical contexts in the US right now where it is getting more and more dangerous to be perceived as trans or gender nonconforming, and we don't know how bad it's going to get. I'm sure many of you are well aware of the validity of these concerns, I should say. Now, regardless of the validity or your assessment of the validity, you can always start from affirming the reality of what is underneath these statements and behaviors. These are expressions of fear or terror, overwhelm, feeling unsafe, feeling uncertain. You can name that and help the client to identify the affect. You can always sort of start and ground yourself in the affect. And then you can offer some psychoeducation on threat responses and help them build a framework for assessing for themselves whether their concerns are based in reality, which again, they often are, and whether their responses are helpful or not. I found that many clients follow up statements like the examples I offered with something like, do I sound crazy? So empowering them to understand what is valid and what is helpful or unhelpful can really be containing. And it also removes you from being in the position of judging how valid a threat is and taking a potentially really invalidating stance. And my wording is deliberate here. Helpful, not good or bad. Is it helpful or unhelpful? Is this response helping me stay safe, helping me be able to live meaningfully, or is it getting in the way of these things? And within a trusting and secure relationship, we can help clients recognize when these responses are getting in the way, when these responses are unhelpful. Psychologist Marcia Root, who's known for her feminist work on trauma theory, described 3 levels of arousal that people experience when facing threat: readiness, alert, and survival, each with increasing level of internal resources directed toward threat response. So readiness describes an ability to detect threat. It involves scanning behaviors, use of working memory. You're quicker to react to stimuli. Alert is the next level. Your body's starting to respond to threatening cues. Not much room for thoughtful emotional reflection, but there's still some metacognition capacity to evaluate threats. Survival is the level of response at which a person can no longer assess the validity of the threat, and as such responds to all possible threats as though they are truly threatening. All energy and focus are redirected toward threat response. Survival level of arousal is necessary when, say, a bear is charging at us and we need to stay alive. But you can't really do anything else when you're at that extreme level of focus on survival. Even simulating it here with this image of a bear might make it hard to focus on what I'm saying. So here is an AI image fail, so our nervous systems can chill out a bit and we can reorient away from survival and back to the task at hand. I tried to have an AI generator create an image of a bear attack and I got this. Anyway, if a client is so caught up in what is going on at a socio-political level that they aren't able to engage meaningfully in that metacognitive task of reflection, if they're struggling to take care of themselves or direct their attention, then their response isn't helpful anymore. Their mind is operating like a bear is charging at them, and that's really not the reality of the situation. As valid and harmful as these threats are, they're threats where helpful responses require planning, reflective thinking, and the ability to engage with challenging emotions. So in other words, for the current crisis, helpful responses are not possible when stuck in high activation. So what do we do when a client seems stuck there? Well, first you can explain it to them just like I did, or in a way that makes sense with your approach to practice, so that your client doesn't interpret your wanting to help them re-regulate as you dismissing the reality of their concerns. Then use your existing tools and approaches as a therapist to help them strengthen skills of calming themselves. You know, modulate it for them like I did with the stress response to the bear photo. And this is going to look different in session depending on how you approach therapeutic work. It could be modeling or co-regulation, explicit skill teaching, practicing sitting with affect together. This is also an area where honestly it can be great to collaborate with psychiatry or psychopharm if someone is really feeling overwhelmed and needs stabilizing help in the nearer term. Helping clients understand exacerbating factors to their distress is also really beneficial. What are the patterns in days where they become overwhelmed? Honestly, it seems obvious, but the most common things I'm seeing as triggers are social media and high news consumption. So encouraging limitations around negative messaging and news can be highly impactful. It might require some specific behavioral intervention because of the addictiveness of platforms like Twitter. And helping a client understand what motivates the appeal, or the appeal might even be too cognitive, but the draw of that doom scrolling can help them disrupt that habit too. Another thing I'm witnessing is that people are generalizing their fear and sense of persecution, or their sense that others are anti-trans and generally unsafe. And this is where I have an example from my own experience. So the bomb threats to Boston Children's Hospital really affected me negatively. They came during a time when I had been targeted by anti-trans threats on Twitter. And I have friends and colleagues at Boston Children's. And then it turns out one of the threats was called in from a town about 20 minutes from me. Shortly after all this, I had to go to that town to get a vaccine appointment. And in the days following, I had this sense that everyone I interacted with would see me as a groomer if they knew I was a trans man and a psychologist who supports gender-affirming care. I felt very unsafe in my objectively safe corner of the world. And I felt like I needed to retreat into only known spaces and hide any signs of transness. Now, in some contexts, this might be an adaptive or a helpful, reasonable response. But honestly, I live in a very queer and progressive area, so this was extreme and was outside of what was helpful. It made me feel depressed and want to withdraw when that was actually the opposite of what I needed. So if I had been your client, you could help me explore, sit with, and understand the triggers and emotional experiences that led to this generalization, and then provide some light psychoeducation about threat generalization as a protective response. There's also an internet meme that is often offered pejoratively, but actually holds great wisdom. If someone gets too lost in a social media discourse, we might say they need to go outside and touch grass. That is, they need to remember that Twitter or Tumblr are not representative of the real world. So for me, getting involved with the PFLAG chapter in Charlotte, North Carolina has been a really helpful way of reminding myself that the world is not exclusively full of anti-trans people. You might encourage clients to engage intentionally with people or settings and experiences that can remind them of the good that's out there. Though again, this all must be done with care to not be dismissive of the actual bad stuff or dangerous people out there, and to not invalidate adaptive fear, mistrust, and protective responses. Another thing you might see in clients is that rumination on threat may be serving to keep them from accessing other difficult or more complicated emotions, like feelings of betrayal, pain, loss of cultural identity, worsened gender dysphoria. So creating space for those more complicated or painful emotions is really necessary in helping clients move out of the all-consuming threat mode. Now, this slide is mostly here for you to return to and summarizes the intervention approaches I just walked through. So this is really with the sort of handout and recording in mind. But this last one, exploration of underlying emotional experiences, I'm going to touch on a bit more. I believe one of our critical tasks as psychotherapists is holding space for the messy emotions that people don't have other opportunities to acknowledge or make sense of. But our ability to be fully present for a person's complex and sometimes very dark internal landscape can be interrupted by our own needs as humans and as clinicians. So if we're feeling weighed down by everything, we might consciously or unconsciously shift sessions towards lighter or more hopeful content. If we're needing to feel helpful, maybe because we're feeling self-conscious about our work as therapists, or because we're feeling powerless in this climate, we may be drawn towards action-oriented problem-solving interventions that are not what the client necessarily needs. So pay attention to what gets in the way of your openness to sitting with clients' difficult emotions around this. You being attuned and present and not responding by abandoning or criticizing or seeming overwhelmed is part of what is healing. Additionally, helping clients stay present to their own difficult and emotional and complex emotions helps them build the capacity to tolerate those emotions and stay regulated. And it communicates that you believe they can handle difficult emotional content. You know, when I asked folks on Twitter what they wanted therapists to know about their needs in this moment in history, a trans Floridian who's also a parent said they needed to be able to use therapy to deal with the emotions related to everything they're facing, but also to grieve what their lives can't hold right now or in the foreseeable future because their energy and time has been so hijacked. Notice they didn't say they wanted a therapist to help them stop grieving. They want a therapist to hold space for them to grieve. Now, let's talk about resilience. The world needs to change to be better for trans and non-binary people. Until it does, or until it does adequately enough, there is incredible liberatory and healing power in being able to weather adversity. And resilience-focused work is a key complement to sitting in painful emotions with the client without getting lost or stuck there. So I selected images here of various projects in which trans people are gardening, farming, and building homes in community. We know that engagement in activities that empower you, where you are actively contributing to the change you want to see, are valuable sources of resilience to climates that degrade our sense of efficacy. We also know that meaningful connection to others is very important for resilience. And at a time when it is all too easy to internalize all of the negative messages about trans and non-binary people, connection to other trans folks can remind us of how okay it is to be trans, excellent and beautiful even, which facilitates the pride and acceptance that are key to resilience within a biased climate. Experiences of joy and awe are also so valuable. And I love this illustration by artist Perchita as a way of expressing the power of moments of joy. They don't necessarily change or even obscure the reality of the hard situations people are in, but they do transform the overall experience of life and contribute to a sense that life can be meaningful and worthwhile amidst awful challenges. I have often shared this piece of art with clients and friends and encouraged clients to identify accessible sources of joy and awe and structure their life to prioritize them however is possible. If you followed me on social media, you might know that for me, this has involved developing a joyful and awe-inspiring birding practice and doing things like pony sweat, which is a sort of collective joyful movement in the form of punky queer dance aerobics. Helping people connect with stories of trans and non-binary resistance is also beneficial. Many people find strength and hope in turning to stories of trans people who built lives for themselves in the unwelcoming social and political environments of the past or of other oppressive climates in the modern era, or by reading accounts from Indigenous leaders on their histories of gender diversity and remembering that we've always been here. There are some amazing trans scholars who have compiled these histories, and we've included some of these resources on the resource handout. And this anchoring in resistance narratives is related to the concept of radical hope. Radical hope is part of the radical healing framework developed as an approach to healing and resilience in communities of color. Radical hope is hope that is rooted in collectivism and in action, and is not dismissive of the harsh realities of oppression. So I strongly encourage you to look into the work coming from French and colleagues, including this recent paper by their team, exploring how Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color make sense of radical hope in the face of intersectional oppression. Additionally, I want to recommend reading Dr. Matsuno's work with Dr. Tanya Israel on interventions that promote resilience in our communities. Outside of the explicit psychology realm, I've been drawn to trans literature and trans studies, and particularly Dr. Hill Malatino's recent work on what he has described as trans endurance. So there's a lot of excellent work for folks wanting to expand their capacities on this question of how do we endure, or how do we help communities and clients endure and live meaningfully during difficult times. Now, we wanted to take some time to speak specifically to those of you who, like us, are trans and or non-binary yourselves, or those of you who have family members who are, and to the people supervising clinicians in this group or in these groups. Work focusing on natural disasters and pandemics has explored the nature of shared traumatic reality. What happens where the therapist and client are experiencing in real time the same stressor for which the client is seeking help? This concept is obviously highly applicable here. Shared traumatic realities introduce particular emotional and clinical challenges. Helping a client be present for their reactions means you have to have the capacity to keep your own emotional reactions regulated enough that they don't take the wheel. In my experience, this shared traumatic reality takes more energy than typical sessions because of the multiple levels of regulation required, and because of the emotional impact of my client's suffering when it is so close to what I and my loved ones are experiencing in this same moment. And there is significant potential benefit to a client. So many trans clients of trans therapists report huge relief in being able to more quickly set aside that adaptive guardedness that is inherent to interactions with cisgender people. The sense of solidarity, even if it is somewhat projected from the client, can be a source of healing and resilience. And additionally, and maybe most importantly, proximity to the stressor can help therapists better understand their clients' experiences and be better attuned to what their client is expressing and not expressing. Though here too represents a risk, making assumptions about your client's experience while being less vigilant to that risk of misattunement because of the sense of shared identity. So taking care of your own emotions, but also engaging in critical self-reflection and or getting supervision are really helpful in navigating the challenges and making room for the benefits of having this shared reality. Many papers on shared traumatic reality also talk about the value to the therapist of helping others process and navigate challenges that they too are facing. There is this potential for empowerment and shared growth and resilience. I have found it very meaningful to be able to be present for members of my community through all of this. Though I say that with a great deal of caution and warning, because I believe it's dangerous to center your own growth as a motivation in clinical work. So it's important to be sure you're getting those needs met outside of these therapeutic relationships too. Okay, and now Dr. Matsuno is going to close us out by talking about advocacy and avoiding burnout.
All right, everyone. So I know that we don't have very much time today, so I'm not going to be able to go into a lot of depth, but we just wanted to leave a few thoughts about advocacy as we wrap up. And so on the next slide, the first, I just wanted to share a few thoughts. So number one, we're experiencing so many attacks in so many different areas, and we can't do everything all at once as much as we want to. So we need to be strategic about where we focus our energy so that we don't burn out and get overwhelmed. And I think something that can be really helpful is to think about what are our strengths that we already have, right? As psychologists, as mental health practitioners, we have a lot of strengths that we can bring to advocacy efforts. For example, communication skills, our writing, our relationship building skills. Maybe people really enjoy doing things that are creative. Whatever you enjoy doing and what you're good at, I would try to see how can that be translated into some kind of advocacy effort. When we do things that is our strength, that helps us feel efficacious in what we're doing, and that encourages us to keep going. So I think that's a useful tool in thinking about how we can focus our efforts. The second thing is to not give up. And I just want to say, like, for myself, I've definitely wanted to give up. I've had moments of hopelessness and feeling really overwhelmed and exhausted. But, when I think about what's going on, the reason that there's so much legislation, all these different types of attacks happening all across the country, and the amount of attacks, the goal is so that we give up. The goal is that we get overwhelmed and we just throw in the towel. And so we can't let them win. We can't stop. And we have to realize that every single act counts. There's no act that is insignificant. Signing a petition, posting something on social media, all of those things collectively is what is going to drive our resistance and make a difference. And then finally, something that I think is so important, but can be underrated, undervalued sometimes, is just having conversations with other people. Right now, there's a lot of misinformation happening out there, and that is what's driving these political bills from going through. So if we can educate ourselves about the science, educate ourselves about what these other arguments are and how those are false. For example, the notion of social contagion, or that anybody who transitions is going to regret it, right? How can we educate ourselves about those narratives so that we can push back, we can have conversations with others, and we can disrupt this political discourse, because that is how we're going to get people motivated to fight back against these bills. So just practically speaking, there's several ways that we can advocate. So one is within legislative systems, and I highly encourage people to get involved, especially if you're in states where this legislation is happening, calling, emailing legislators, putting pressure on them, volunteering, going to protests, donating your time or money. I think as psychologists, we can use our expertise in mental health and provide testimony at court cases, or otherwise create educational materials. So I encourage all of us to think about what ways we can advocate legislatively. But then I think it's also important that we advocate within our own clinical systems and within our own field. These anti-trans narratives are spreading. They really seem conspiracy theory to me, but they're becoming mainstream. And many people are talking about trans people and the legislation going on. So we need to notice when these anti-trans narratives are seeping into our clinical work, into our clinical agencies. For example, if we, in a clinical consultation, another clinician is doubting the validity of a trans client's identity, or talking about social contagion, or you notice some harmful practices and policies, it's important to be aware of that and to push back against those harmful policies. Something that you can do to help with that is to promote education among your colleagues, provide resources. This webinar will be available on YouTube, share it with others. I think all of that is also super important. And then the last thing I want to talk about is avoiding burnout, which I think is so important. I mean, this legislation is absolutely overwhelming. It feels like we need to be doing something 24 hours a day because there's so many harmful things happening. And it can be hard to give ourselves permission to take breaks, to not engage with this what's going on, and just live our lives, do something else completely. I know for myself, I sometimes feel guilty if I'm not constantly looking at the news and figuring out ways that I can fight back. But it is so essential that we set boundaries, that we take breaks, because we need to sustain ourselves in this fight so that we can continue moving towards liberation. So things like not going down that Twitter rabbit hole and reading all kinds of anti-trans things happening on there, taking breaks from social media, all of those things are really helpful and important. Something that I think can happen, this is just a personal experience, is that sometimes I feel like I'm fighting this fight alone, and that if I'm not constantly advocating or doing something, that I'm going to be letting my community down, or that no one else is going to step up, and that all these terrible things are going to happen. I'm taking on all of this responsibility, but it's not just me. None of us can do this alone. We are a collective of many different groups. We are fighting for liberation, and it's important that we trust in other people, that we trust that people are stepping up when we need to step back, just like I'm stepping up when other people need to step back. And I think that kind of mindset can help us to take those breaks and continue going. One thing that I always love and always helps me is Audre Lorde's quote that self-preservation is an act of political warfare. I think this can be really helpful for trans clients who are getting burned out from advocacy. Taking care of ourselves, loving ourselves, that is an act of resistance. There are people out there who are trying to erase us. And so by existing and self-preserving and loving ourselves, these are radical acts. These are resisting these systems of oppression. And I just wanted to draw attention to this piece of art because I love it so much. It's by a trans artist. And I wanted to end our talk today with just reading this quote by Amir. So the quote says, "Our people are often need to focus on making it through the obstacles each day lays in front of them, focusing on surviving in a world not built for those who defy gender roles. But here we are, existing as beautiful and powerful trans and non-binary people. Let us indulge, let us find pleasure. We deserve it all." So wanted to end there and thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. I just want to invite everybody to join me in thanking Dr. Barr and Dr. Masuno for the rich information and just personal experience they've shared with us today. And thank you everyone for attending and just committing to supporting trans and non-binary folks and for sticking with us a few minutes after the time. So yeah, just so grateful for everyone for their attention and commitment. Just want to plug quickly as a reminder, if you were able to attend the entire meeting today and are a dues paying member of the Society of Counseling Psychology interested in receiving CE credits, I dropped something in the chat there around returning back to the platform and filling out that post-event evaluation survey for us to get a PDF copy of your certificate. And yeah, I hope that you all have a good rest of your day. I'll make sure that we're able to get the slides out to those in attendance, and we'll figure out a way. I'm not sure if it's through the platform directly for folks to be able to access the recording, since I know we had some technical issues. So if you weren't able to attend, if like you came in late or had to leave early, we'll try to get that out to you all. So yeah, just thank you again. I don't know how to like virtually invite all of our attendees to thank our presenters, but thank you all so much for your time and attention. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you next month and in the future months for additional webinars through Division 17. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.